everyone, and welcome back to Homeschool and Chill, the channel that alleviates your anxieties about homeschooling. My name is Corinne, and today I want to talk to you about your children being ahead or behind academically. So, for those of you who are new to homeschooling, that may be one of your biggest anxieties, and you're sitting there wondering, if I homeschool my children, are they going to fall behind? And hopefully, if I do a good enough job, maybe my children will actually be ahead. And as a new homeschool mom, I know that was one of my concerns. I was afraid that my children might fall behind or fall through the gaps or whatever. And I was really focused on all these amazing stories that I heard about homeschoolers who end up doing accelerated work, or they end up graduating from high school at a really young age. I mean, who wouldn't love a success story like that? But the idea of children really being ahead or behind is somewhat of a myth. Okay, so we'll just start with talking about traditional schools like public school or even private schools that have the traditional classroom setting. So there are numerous children who go to school, thousands of children within your state who go to school. And in order for these children to be educated, they have to be kind of broken into groups, manageable groups. And the way that that's traditionally done is by children's age. And so children who are within a certain age are placed within a grade, and then that grade has so many teachers. So that's just the breakdown of how to organize these numerous children. And so when they have all these children and they're broken down into grades, then it's decided there are certain things that these children have to learn. They decided these are the objectives that children this age should be able to achieve. Now, that's not taking in consideration that children develop differently, that children have different backgrounds and different experiences, things that they've been exposed to and have been able to learn or have not been able to learn. None of those things are necessarily taken into consideration. They're just looking at all of these children are at this age, and maybe these are the things that they can be able to achieve at this age. Now, before I have any school teachers trying to come for me and beat me up about all these children's different learning abilities and development not being taken into consideration, I am not talking about the teachers themselves. I do know that there are stellar teachers out there who have students who are at many different levels, and they are like magical in finding ways to diversify whatever they're teaching to make sure that they reach all different levels of their students and meet different students at their learning style. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm bashing the teachers, but that's another thing to consider also, that the standards themselves have these certain expectations of children at a certain age, and therefore parents have certain expectations of what their children should be learning, and that does kind of fall on the classroom teacher when there is no hard fast rule that says that children who are 6 years old should all be able to learn the same thing in a classroom full of other children the same age. So that's another thing to think about the next time you might want to talk about a teacher. It's like they have all these children who are at very different developmental stages and have been exposed to different things and have different learning styles, and they have to make it all work in one classroom. So keep that in mind too. No two children are alike. They develop completely differently. If you get a group of moms all together and you just ask how old was their child when they were potty trained, you'll have some parents who were very excited that their child was potty trained at a very young age, that their child was only a year old and they were able to go to the potty and tell their parents, I gotta go pee pee, and they were so excited. And then there are some parents who might even be embarrassed to mention that their child was 4 years old or maybe even 5 before they were successfully going to the toilet without having accidents all the time. One thing that I say all the time, it's not my quote, but I say it, that comparison is the thief of joy. When you compare yourself or compare your children to others, then there's kind of this standard that says either you're not good enough or that you're better. And so that's kind of the case when it comes to schooling too. When all of these children are expected to learn the exact same information and nothing is taken into consideration like their background or their development or even their gifts and talents in certain areas academically, then there's kind of a competition. I'm not saying that we shouldn't push our children to work hard. I definitely push my children and challenge my children. I think that every homeschool parent does. But this whole idea that your child has to know something by a certain age isn't really important, I don't think. It's not really important. And even when it comes to, um, I guess, just children's gifts and talents, there's just some areas where children are not necessarily going to thrive and shine as brightly as some other children because no one is the same. There's some children who will excel at everything that they touch, it seems, where they make straight A's in everything. And then there's some children who are going to be really strong in some areas, and then they're going to have to really work their tail off just to be okay in other areas. And I think we put an unrealistic pressure or unrealistic expectations on children to be excellent at everything when we don't even have those sort of expectations for ourselves as adults. Like, for instance, I couldn't tell you too much about chemistry or anything really in-depth in science. Like, I know the basics to be, an educated adult, but I can't sit there and have a deep conversation about science like my best friend Tasha can. Tasha can go on and explain to you about viruses and microorganisms and different types of medications and drugs and all these kind of things. And I'm just sitting there like, oh, well, I know the life cycle of a butterfly. Like, but if you want to sit down and you want to talk about prose and alliteration and iambic pentameter and, metaphors and similes and all of those sort of things, then we can go all day and talk about that because that's my area of expertise, if you want to call me an expert. But that is where I thrive. I am an English major. That's where my strong point is. And so since that's where my gifts or talents are, I'm not so great when it comes to the maths and sciences. I do well enough. I did well enough to get a college degree, but I don't really use some of that information in my day-to-day life, so a lot of it has gotten forgotten. So I can't tell you much about quadratic equations. I'm just impressed that I can remember to say that phrase. But those are not my strong suits. And that's the same with most adults. Most of us are really great with hands-on things and maybe not so great with like what people would call intellectual sort of things. And then intellectuals sometimes are not so great with their hands. And all of these people are valuable. All these people are needed and are necessary in society for their gifts and talents and what they have to offer. And so we have to nurture that in our children. Back to the whole thing I was mentioning before about in traditional schools, how they're trying to just organize these thousands of children to be educated in an organized fashion. So they organize these children according to their age. And then they decide, well, we got to teach them something. So this is what we're going to teach children at this age. And we're going to call it first grade or whatever. So that may not necessarily mean that children who are 6 to 7 years old are only capable of learning those objectives. And that doesn't mean that children who are 6 and 7 year olds will be capable of achieving those objectives in that year. Okay? So many people don't realize it, but a lot of homeschoolers don't even assign a grade to their children. There are some that do, but a lot of us don't, because objectives and standards can change just depending on the curriculum that you choose or the state that you live in. Even if your child is going to public school, a lot of the objectives and standards aren't necessarily going to be the same for New Mexico as they are in Maryland. I've had lots of people in my experience in teaching in schools where they've had children move from state to state, and there is a dramatic difference in what is expected of their child, where they move from a state where it's what's considered a low-performing state, and then they move to another state, and their child is overwhelmed because they weren't prepared for the material that was being covered. So it's not like there's a hard, fast rule of this is what a child has to learn at this age. It can vary from state to state, and it can vary from curriculum to curriculum. And so depending on your child's learning style, you may have more than one curriculum that you even choose to teach your child from. And so in language arts, your child may be in first grade, but in math, your child may be in second grade or maybe third grade. It's very common, I think, for a lot of homeschoolers where someone asks, oh, what grade are you in? And then the homeschool child is just like a deer in headlights. And it's not because they just don't understand school or they don't know what grade that they're in. But when it comes to homeschooling, a lot of the time, there is no grade. You're just doing the best that you can. And so if that means you're doing third grade level work on this curriculum, then that's what you do. And in another curriculum, it may be different. Or even if your parent is using the same curriculum across the board, you might just be excelling more in one subject than another because that's where your gifts and talents are. Like I mentioned before, I'm an English major and that's where I really excel. But as far as maths and sciences, that's not my strong point. So if I were homeschooled, which I wasn't as a child, if I was a homeschooler, then I probably would have been able to do more advanced language arts work growing up than I would have my mathematics. So I just wanted to kind of dispel that myth, and I think I'll try to do a series of videos explaining how homeschool is a lot different than traditional school. And that's something to try to keep in mind too for those of you who are temporarily quarantine schooling, where you're homeschooling temporarily, but it's really public school at home. There is a dramatic difference. And I'm here to assist you, whether you have been homeschooling all along, or you're new to homeschooling, or you're homeschooling just because of the coronavirus. I'm here to assist all of you. But I do want to kind of put it out there that it is very different to be following a public school tradition at home versus fully homeschooling and doing just whatever works for you and your family at the time. So that's just one of the many things that's very different about homeschooling, that there really is no such thing as ahead or behind, because when you say ahead or when you say behind, immediately there is a comparison. Ahead of whom or behind whom? And so that really means like the whole purpose is to compare your child to someone else. And really that's not the purpose of homeschooling anyway. It's not to compare your child to someone else. It's just to have a tailor-made education that is specific to your child, to meet them where they are and have them work the best that they can where they are. Even if that means they're not exactly where other children are, you're really making sure that they master the information that they're trying to learn instead of just pushing them along because everybody else is doing it. So I hope that this answered some questions that you might have had about homeschooling, or just gave you some new insight that you may not have had before. If you have any questions, or if you have suggestions for another topic for me to talk about, make sure you type that in the comments. I really hope that you liked this video, and if you did, I hope that you like, share, and subscribe. But most of all, I hope that you love yourselves and stay healthy. Bye, loves.